The red pen hovered over yet another meandering paragraph. This one describing how a forest fire had destroyed the student's childhood home, forcing their family to start over. The essay was raw and honest, exactly what I'd asked for in my American Gothic literature and personal narrative seminar. Too honest, maybe? I set the pen down and leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking in the silence of my office at Northern Michigan University. Monday afternoons were always quiet on this side of campus. Most faculty cleared out after their morning classes, but I preferred grading when the hallways emptied. The students' descriptions of smoke and flames, of cherished objects turned to ash, pulled at something inside me. Not the fire, we'd never had one at our cabin, but the loss. The sudden, total change. I rubbed my eyes and checked the clock, 4:18 p.m. The wind shook the window behind me, bringing the first bite of winter. November in Marquette brought early darkness and memories I'd spent decades trying to outrun. My phone buzzed. A text from the department chair about tomorrow's faculty meeting. I replied with a quick confirmation, then returned to the essays. But the students' words had done their work. Cracking open a door, I usually kept firmly shut. At 38, I'd made a life pretty different from my childhood. Professor Thomas Wilson had little in common with 10-year-old Tommy, who grew up in that small cabin 8 miles outside Marquette. My colleagues knew me as careful, quiet, which helped me get my tenure-track job. What they didn't know was where those traits came from. Growing up in the early 90s meant isolation for a kid in the Upper Peninsula. Our cabin sat at the end of a gravel road, with pines and hardwoods all around. No neighbors, no cable TV, no distractions from my father's version of building character. Robert Wilson believed boys became men through calluses and sweat. By age 7, I had daily chores that would have seemed excessive even to other rural families. By 8, I could split logs with an axe. By 9, I tracked deer through fresh snow and helped butcher what we brought home. These weren't options or games. They were expectations. A Wilson pulls his weight, my father would say. His face weathered even then, eyes constantly scanning the tree line as though looking for something. I never questioned why he was always watching the woods. That came later. The memories came back as I looked at the ungraded essay. My 10th birthday didn't have a cake or presents wrapped in colorful paper. Instead, my father gave me a .22 rifle, putting it in my hands like it was a really important moment. A gun makes you a provider, not a hero, he'd said, his calloused hand heavy on my shoulder. You respect what it does. You honor what it takes. My mother, Sarah, had watched from the doorway. She never contradicted my father, at least not in front of me. But that night she'd slipped into my room with a small wrapped package, a compass with my initials engraved on the back. "So you always find your way home," she'd whispered. The contradiction of my parents shaped me more than either probably realized. Father with his strict expectations, mother with her quiet acts of kindness. But neither was my true companion during those isolated years. That role belonged to Bandit. The memory of him made me push away from my desk. I walked to the window watching students hurry across the quad, heads down against the wind. Bandit had been an Airedale Terrier with wiry fur and tons of energy. Dad had brought him home as a puppy when I was 8. Not as a pet, but as a working dog. But from the first night, when he'd snuck into my bed and curled against my chest, he was mine. If I closed my eyes, I could still feel his coarse fur against my fingers. Still hear his excited bark when I returned from school. He'd follow me everywhere, chopping wood, checking traps, exploring the streams and ridges near our property. He slept at the foot of my bed every night for 2 years. The wind picked up outside my office window, blowing dead leaves around. Fall. It always brought the memories back more clearly, especially thoughts of that particular autumn. 1995. The fall, everything changed. Thanksgiving approached, and with it the annual family gathering. Uncles, aunts, and cousins would come to my grandfather's bigger property, 20 miles deeper into the woods. That year my father decided I was old enough for a special responsibility. "Time you showed everyone what you're made of," he said one evening in early November. The fire crackled in the wood stove as he reached behind his chair and pulled out his most prized possession, the Winchester that had belonged to his father. He rarely let anyone touch it, this relic from a harder time. "You're going to provide the main course this year," he continued, holding the rifle with reverence before extending it toward me. "Bring back something that'll make everyone proud." My mother looked up from her mending. Concern flashed across her face before she smoothed it away. "He's ready, Robert." My father nodded once, firmly. "He's a Wilson." I took the Winchester, surprised by its weight, by the worn smoothness of the woodstock that had been handled by generations before me. Pride filled my chest along with a flutter of nervousness. This wasn't the .22 I'd been practicing with. This was the real thing. A man's gun. "Don't let me down," my father said, his eyes holding mine. There was something else there, too. Something I couldn't name then. Worry? Fear? Whatever it was, it vanished quickly behind his usual stern expression. "I won't," I promised. The next morning would be my first solo hunt with the Winchester. Bandit would accompany me, of course, he always did. I went to bed that night filled with anticipation, visualizing the perfect shot, imagining the approval on my father's face when I returned successful. I didn't know then that I'd return changed, that we all would. I turned from the window in my university office. 28 years later, and sometimes I still felt just like that same kid. I woke before my alarm, too excited to sleep any longer. My grandfather's Winchester leaned against my bedroom wall where I'd propped it the night before. Bandit sensed my excitement, his tail thumping against the floor as I dressed in layers for the November chill. The kitchen light glowed yellow as I moved quietly, fixing myself a quick breakfast. Mom had left a thermos of hot chocolate and a wrapped sandwich on the counter with a note. "Good luck, Tommy. Be careful." Dad was already outside checking the truck before heading to his construction job. He stopped me at the door, giving me a long look. "Remember what I taught you?" he said, adjusting the collar of my jacket. "One clean shot, make it count." "I will. Bandit stays with you at all times," he added, an unusual hint of concern in his voice. "Back before dark, no exceptions." I nodded, picking up the Winchester like I'd done many times before. It was heavier than my .22. Bandit walked around my legs, eager to get going. Dad got in his truck but rolled down the window. "A Wilson provides," he called out. Our family motto almost. "A Wilson provides," I repeated, standing straighter. The forest welcomed us as the first light spread through the trees. Frost crunched under my boots, and my breath clouded in front of my face. November in the Upper Peninsula meant serious cold, but I hardly noticed it. This hunt mattered. My first real chance to prove myself to Dad, to the whole family. Bandit trotted ahead, nose to the ground, perfectly in his element. We'd trained together for smaller game, but he knew this was different. I could tell by the way he moved, more focused, less playful. The woods stretched for miles in every direction. Our property connected to state forest land, creating an unbroken wilderness that made me feel tiny. Usually I felt comfortable there. I had space to breathe, to explore, to escape Dad's watchful eyes for a few hours. Today it felt like a test. I worried the size of the forest would make it harder to succeed. I followed deer trails deeper into the trees, checking for fresh tracks, rubbed bark, or droppings. Dad had taught me to look for signs in the forest, to notice where branches were broken or leaves disturbed. The bandit ranged ahead, occasionally looking back to make sure I followed. The morning slipped away. 1 hour became 2, then 3. My shoulders ached from carrying the Winchester, and disappointment settled heavy in my stomach. Other kids got video games for their birthdays. I got the chance to freeze in the woods and fail in front of my father. By mid-morning, I was getting really frustrated and losing confidence. I'd seen nothing worth shooting, just squirrels and chickadees. Bandit seemed to pick up on my mood, staying closer, occasionally pressing his warm body against my leg. What am I going to tell Dad? I asked Bandit, scratching behind his ears, that I walked around for hours and came back empty-handed. Bandit looked up at me with those brown eyes that always seemed to understand everything. I know. Keep trying. I pushed on, moving toward the small marsh where Dad said migratory birds sometimes stopped. I pictured returning home with the Winchester in one hand and a big buck dragged behind me with the other. Dad would clap me on the shoulder, maybe even smile. "That's my boy," he'd say. The fantasy kept me going as the sun climbed higher. I stepped carefully, watching where I placed each foot to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The temperature had warmed enough to melt the morning frost, making the forest floor slightly damp and quiet under my boots. Just as I considered turning back, a sound caught my attention, the unmistakable honking of geese. I looked up through gaps in the branches and saw them, a V formation passing overhead. Without thinking, I raised the Winchester, tracking the lead bird through the iron sights just as Dad had taught me. "Lead the target." His words came back to me. "They're moving faster than you think." I exhaled halfway, steadied my arms, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked against my shoulder, the report crashing through the quiet forest. One goose folded mid-flight, plummeting through the branches. I'd done it. Joy surged through me as I ran to where the bird had fallen. It was a clean kill. Through the body, not messy. Perfect. I picked up the goose, still warm, and felt a bubble of pride expand in my chest. Not a deer, but a respectable showing for Thanksgiving. Something I'd shot with Grandpa's gun. "Look, Bandit." I turned to show him, already picturing Dad's reaction. That's when I noticed the change in Bandit's posture. His body went rigid, ears forward, the fur along his spine standing on end. A low growl vibrated from his chest, a sound I'd never heard him make before. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, reaching for his collar. Before my fingers could touch him, Bandit bolted. He shot between the trees like he'd been fired from a gun himself, barking like crazy in a way that made my stomach knot up. "Bandit!" I shouted, shoving the goose into my game bag. "Bandit! Come back!" I took off after him. Winchester clutched in my hands, branches whipping against my face. Bandit never disobeyed, never ran off. Something was wrong. I followed his barking through a stand of pines, then across a small creek. His voice changed from alarm to something worse, pain mixed with fear. The sound pushed me faster, my chest tight with each breath. "Bandit," I called again, panic edging my voice. I pushed through the bushes into a small clearing and stopped cold. A deer was lying on its side, its legs barely moving, with its throat ripped open. Blood soaked the leaves around it and steam rose from the red puddle in the cool air. I froze for only a second before I heard something worse from my left. Bandit's whimper suddenly cut off. About 20 feet away behind a fallen log was Bandit. His body was twitching and I thought at first he was just hurt and needed help. Then I saw it. His stomach torn open, his guts spilled out onto the ground, and bent over him with its back to me was something my brain couldn't make sense of. The thing had no hair, with sick-looking pale skin pulled tight over what looked like just bones. It made wet, slurping sounds as it ate my dog, its long fingers with way too many joints pulling at Bandit's insides. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The Winchester just hung there useless in my hands that had gone numb. Then the thing stopped. It went completely still, like a video on pause. Slowly it turned toward me and I saw its face. Something straight out of a nightmare. Where eyes should be, there were just smooth dents. Its nose was just two slits above a mouth that stretched way too wide across its face. It didn't look at me exactly, more like it pointed its face my way. Its nostrils opened wide, taking quick, shallow breaths. It tilted its head like it was listening. Right then, I realized something for sure. It couldn't see me, but it could tell I was there somehow. My movement, my smell, some sound I made. Something was giving me away. I just stood there frozen, watching this thing that killed my dog sniff the air between us. One thought kept repeating in my head, drowning out everything else. "Don't move. Don't move. Don't move. I couldn't move. The creature kept feeding on Bandit, making wet, sickly sounds as it pulled at his insides. My muscles locked in place, my mind screaming to run while my body refused to obey. Every instinct told me that movement meant death. The thing paused again, its noseless face turning slightly to the left, then right. It seemed to be listening, testing the air. After what felt like hours, but must have been seconds, it returned to Bandit's body, tearing away chunks with those long, jointed fingers. I wanted to shoot it. The Winchester weighed heavy in my hands, a simple movement of finger on trigger, all that was needed. But terror glued me in place, convinced that any sound would bring those teeth toward my throat next. Eventually, the creature straightened. It wiped its elongated hands across what passed for its mouth, smearing dark fluid across its pale skin. Then it grabbed Bandit's remains, dragging them with unnatural strength toward the denser part of the forest. The deer carcass followed, pulled by its other arm. Only when it disappeared into the trees did my body unlock. My legs buckled and I dropped to my knees. A sob built in my throat, but I swallowed it down. The thing might still hear me. I scrambled up, the Winchester slipping from my numb fingers to the forest floor. The goose I'd shot lay forgotten in my game bag as I turned and ran. Branches whipped my face, roots tried to trip me, but nothing mattered except getting away. The forest that had been my second home became an endless maze of terror. Every shadow held danger, every sound the creature returning. I ran without direction until I spotted a familiar deer trail, then followed it blindly, stumbling and gasping. The cabin appeared ahead and my pace quickened. Tears flowed freely now, hot tracks down my cold face. I burst through the door, letting it bang against the wall. Dad jerked upright from his chair, surprised turning to confusion as he took in my appearance. I must have looked wild. Face scratched from branches, clothes dirty from falling, eyes wide with horror. "Tommy?" He stood, setting aside the book he'd been reading. "What happened? Where's—" His eyes dropped to my empty hands. Then he looked behind me like he was expecting to see what I was carrying. His face got hard. "Where's the gun?" I tried to speak, but only ragged breaths came out. My whole body shook. "Bandit," I finally managed. "He's dead. There was a thing in the woods. It killed him." Dad's expression changed, his jaw tightening. "What thing?" "A monster," I said, the word sounding childish even to my ears. "It was eating a deer. Then it got Bandit. It had no eyes, just holes and fingers with too many joints and stop." Dad raised his hand. The word cut through my rambling like a blade. "Where is my father's rifle?" Mom came from the kitchen then, drying her hands on a towel. "Robert, what's going on?" She looked at me, worry on her face. "Tommy, you're shaking." "He came back without the Winchester," Dad said, his voice flat. "Says some monster got banded. I'm not lying." My voice cracked. "It killed him. It tore him open and ate him right in front of me." Dad's expression changed from anger to something worse. Disappointment. Making up stories won't bring back my father's rifle. "Robert," Mom said quietly, moving toward me. "Look at him. Something happened. Something happened all right." Dad grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. "We're going back right now to get the truth." My stomach plunged. "No, Dad, we can't go back there. It's still out there." He paused, one arm in his jacket sleeve. "You left your grandfather's Winchester in the woods because you got scared. Fine, you're 10, but lying about it?" He shook his head. "A Wilson faces the truth." Mom placed her hand on my shoulder. "Maybe you should let him calm down first, Robert. The sun sets in an hour. We go now." He held my coat out to me. "Put this on." My legs barely carried me as we left the cabin. Mom watched from the door, her face tight with worry. The woods looked different now, threatening in a way they never had before. Dad walked ahead, his back straight, shoulders set in a way that left no room for argument. The silence between us stretched. Usually Dad talked while we walked, pointing out tracks or teaching me the names of trees. Now there was nothing but the sound of our boots on fallen leaves. "Dad, I tried once, I'm not making it up." "We'll see." The sun was getting lower in the sky by the time we reached the clearing. I hung back, not wanting to see what might be waiting. Dad stopped abruptly. This where it happened. I nodded, unable to look. He moved forward, looking at the ground carefully. I forced myself to join him, staying close to his side. The clearing was empty. No bandit, no deer. But dark, rust-colored stains soaked the fallen leaves and moss. In places, the earth had been messed up, leaves scattered in violent patterns. Dad crouched, touching the largest bloodstain with his fingertips. "See?" I pointed at the stains. "That's Bandit's blood. And over there, that's where the deer was. The thing dragged them both away." Dad stood, wiping his fingers on his pants. His face had reddened, whether from exertion or anger I couldn't tell. Still sticking to your monster story, he walked to the fallen log and reached behind it, pulling out the Winchester. "Found this at least." He checked it over carefully, jaw tight. Then he slung it over his shoulder, looking around once more. "Animals drag away carcasses all the time," he said finally. "A coyote probably got your dog. Happens in these woods." "It wasn't a coyote." My voice rose. "I know what I saw." "Where's that goose you shot?" Dad asked, ignoring my outburst. "You did shoot something, didn't you?" I reached for my game bag, then froze. In my panic, I'd forgotten all about the goose. I dropped it when I ran." Dad's eyes narrowed. "So you shot a goose, Bandit ran off, and instead of looking for him, you dropped everything and ran home with a wild story about monsters?" He shook his head. "That's not how I raised you. I'm telling the truth." I jabbed my finger toward the bloodstains. "Look at all the blood. That's not from a coyote." Dad studied the ground again. His face scrunched up. For a second I thought he might believe me. Then he straightened, adjusting the Winchester on his shoulder. "Let's go home before dark," he said, his voice softer, but no less final. "Your mother will be worried." As we turned to leave, I took one last look at the clearing. In the fading light, the bloodstains looked black against the forest floor, spreading out across the ground. Somewhere in these woods, that thing was still out there. With what remained of Bandit? Dad placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, guiding me away. "Now where's that goose you shot?" "Now where's that goose you shot?" Dad asked, squinting at the darkening forest floor. I pointed in the general direction I'd been running from. "Back that way, I think." "I dropped it when I heard Bandit." Dad grunted, adjusting the Winchester on his shoulder. He started walking in the direction I'd pointed, looking at the ground carefully. I stayed close behind him. The idea of going deeper into the forest again made my stomach twist. "We're not leaving a perfectly good bird out here," he said, his voice quieter than before. "And you need to learn that running away doesn't solve problems." I wanted to tell him again that I wasn't making up stories, that the bloodstains proved something had killed Bandit. But arguing with Dad never changed his mind. Instead, I followed in silence, my body stiff as we moved through the increasingly dark woods. We searched for about 10 minutes, retracing what I thought was my path. The light was fading faster now, the sun sinking behind the trees. Dad walked confidently, not showing any of the fear that still had my hands shaking. That's when I noticed the silence. The forest was always full of sounds, chickadees calling, squirrels rustling through branches, the occasional distant crow. Now, there was nothing. Just our footsteps on the damp leaves and the sound of our breathing. "Dad," I said, my voice barely audible. "What?" He didn't look up from examining the ground. "Listen." He stood up straight, turning his head a bit. I knew he heard it too. Total silence. His eyes narrowed as they looked over the trees around us. "Let's head back," I said in a please. "Not without that goose." But his voice had lost its certainty. We kept looking, Dad moving more cautiously now. I stayed within arm's reach, the back of my neck prickling. Something was watching us. I could feel it, a pressure in the air, and attention focused on our movements. "Dad," I whispered again. "We need to go." He ignored me, bending down to check a patch of disturbed leaves. The Winchester was still slung over his shoulder, not ready in his hands where it should have been. A branch snapped somewhere behind us. I grabbed Dad's sleeve, tugging hard. "Did you hear that?" "Just the wind," he said, brushing my hand away. But there was no wind. The air was still and cold around us, the trees not moving at all. Then came a sound that made me freeze, a wet, raspy breathing like someone choking. It came from behind some pine trees about 30 yards away. Dad finally stopped looking around and turned toward the noise. He stiffened up. He grabbed his Winchester off his shoulder and quickly raised it, ready to shoot. The pale thing came out from between the trees, crawling on all fours like a person, but all wrong. Its arms and legs were too long, bending in weird ways. Its skin was tight on its bones, a dirty white color as daylight was ending. When it raised its head, I could see it had no eyes, just empty holes that somehow pointed right at us. I watched Dad's face change. His doubt disappeared and turned to fear as he realized I'd been telling the truth all along. His jaw tightened, the muscle in his cheek twitching. "Don't move." He breathed. So quietly, I barely heard him. The creature's head tilted, its nostril slits flaring as it sniffed the air. It took one jerky step forward, then another. Dad's finger moved to the trigger. "When I shoot, you run," he whispered. "Straight home, don't stop, don't look back." The gunshot blasted through the quiet forest, the sound bouncing between trees. The creature jerked when the bullet hit its shoulder, black fluid spraying from the wound, but it didn't fall. It didn't even stagger back. Instead, its mouth with no lips opened silently, showing rows of needle-thin teeth. Then it charged, running crazy fast in a scrambling way that looked completely wrong. "Run." Dad grabbed my arm, yanking me backward. We turned and sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at our faces. I'd never seen Dad run like that, not even when he raced me for fun. His hand gripped my upper arm so hard it hurt, but that grip saved me when my foot caught a root and I pitched forward. He hauled me upright without stopping, practically dragging me for several steps until I found my footing again. "Keep going," he shouted, risking a glance over his shoulder. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know how close it was. The sound of its breathing drove us forward, that terrible wet rasping growing louder when we slowed, fading slightly when we pushed harder. The tree line appeared ahead, then the clearing around our cabin. We burst from the woods, legs burning, lungs heaving. Dad pushed me ahead of him across the yard. "Inside. Now." Mom stood in the doorway, her face going pale as she saw us running. "Robert? Tommy? What?" "Inside," Dad repeated, shoving me through the door past her, then slamming it shut behind us. His hands were shaking as he slid the deadbolt into place, then reached for the box of shells on the shelf by the Robert. "What happened?" Mom asked, backing away from the door. Dad didn't answer as he broke open the Winchester, hands trembling so badly he dropped the first shell. He cursed. Something he never did in front of me, and tried again, managing to load a fresh round. I pressed my face to the window, searching the tree line. "Is it following us?" "Get away from the window," Dad snapped, pulling me back. He took my place, peering through the glass, the Winchester ready in his hands. Dad stayed by the window all night, Winchester ready, watching the tree line. Mom tried asking questions, but his answers came in short bursts between long stretches of silence. I huddled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, too scared to go to my room alone. "It was some kind of animal," Dad finally told Mom, his voice flat. "Attacked bandit came after us." "What kind of animal?" Mom asked. Dad's eyes never left the window. "Don't know." I opened my mouth to tell her the truth, that it wasn't any animal, that it was something impossible. But Dad cut me off with a sharp look. The warning in his eyes was clear: keep quiet. We slept in the living room that night, all three of us. Dad didn't sleep at all. Every time I woke up, I found him in the same position, looking out at the darkness, the Winchester across his lap. By morning, Dad had made a list. He drove to town and came back with new deadbolts, window locks, and enough canned food to last a month. Mom watched him install everything without asking more questions, but her eyes followed him with new worry. He worked carefully, testing each lock multiple times, making sure nothing could get in. The next day, he drove to Marquette again and came back with a for sale sign that he hammered into the frozen ground next to our mailbox. I watched from the window as he pulled out all his traps from the shed and loaded them into the truck. "What are you doing with those?" I asked when he came back inside. "Selling them," he said, removing his gloves, finger by finger. "Not hunting anymore." Mom looked up from the potatoes she was peeling. "Robert, are you sure?" "We need the money," was all he said. In the following days, Dad sold almost everything. His compound bow, the skinning knives, the fishing gear, even his collection of antler trophies that had hung on our walls for as long as I could remember. The only things he kept were his father's Winchester and 2 boxes of ammunition, which never moved from their spot by the front door. School started again after Thanksgiving break, but everything felt different. The other kids talked about what they got for Christmas, what they did during the snow days, which high school team won the hockey tournament. None of it mattered. While they laughed at lunch, I kept seeing bandits inside spilling onto the forest floor, kept hearing that wet breathing getting closer behind us as we ran. Mrs. Patterson called me to her desk during art time. "Tommy, do you want to tell me about your drawing?" I looked down at the paper where I'd drawn the thing from the woods. I'd tried to get it right. The pale, stretched skin, the too many joints in its fingers, the holes where eyes should have been. I shook my head. "You've been very quiet since coming back from break," she said, tipping her head to look at my face. "Is everything okay at home?" I nodded, not meeting her eyes. "You know you can talk to me about anything that's bothering you." I clutched my pencil tighter, pressing the tip until it broke against the paper. "I'm fine." When I got home that day, Mom was on the phone, her back to me as I came through the door. "Yes, Mrs. Patterson, I understand your concern." "No, nothing unusual has happened at home." Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of beer in front of him. He never drank before dinner. "Your teacher called," he said when Mom hung up. "Said you're drawing monsters." I stared at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. "Let me see your backpack." I handed it over without argument. He pulled out my folder and flipped through my schoolwork until he found the drawings. Not just today's, but others I'd made during the week when I was supposed to be working on math. 5 drawings of the creature, each one trying to capture what I'd seen. Dad's face went hard. He took the drawings to the wood stove, opened the iron door, and fed them in one by one. The paper curled and blackened in the flames. "Tommy," he said, still watching the fire consume my drawings. "What did you see in the woods that day?" "The monster," I whispered. He turned to face me. "And what did I tell the police when they came looking for the Miller boy last week? That we didn't see anything unusual?" "That's right." Dad crouched down so we were eye to eye. "Some things we keep in the family. You understand? People will think you're crazy if you talk about monsters. They'll think we're both crazy." "But it was real," I said, my voice breaking. "You saw it too." "I know what I saw," he said quietly, "and I know what happens to people who talk about things like that." His hand gripped my shoulder. "We protect our own. That means we keep quiet about some things, even if it's the truth, especially if it's the truth." That night I heard Mom and Dad arguing in their bedroom. I crept down the hallway, sitting just outside their door where their voices carried. "We should move," Mom said, her voice pleading. "You know what you saw." "This is our home," Dad shot back. "I won't be chased off." "What about Tommy? He's not the same since whatever happened out there." "He'll be fine. Boys bounce back." "Do they?" "Because you haven't been the same either, Robert. You jump at every sound, you barely sleep. You sold everything you used to love doing. I'm protecting this family by keeping us here. After what happened to Bandit, After whatever you saw in those woods. There was a long silence. When Dad spoke again, his voice was lower. Sarah, we've put everything we have into this place. Where would we go? What would we do? Anywhere else, Mom said. A place without those woods. And live how? On what? The argument continued, but I slipped back to my bed, pulling the blankets over my head. I knew we wouldn't move. Dad never changed his mind once it was set. Winter turned harsh after that. Snow piled against the cabin walls in deep drifts, and the wind howled around the corners at night. I used to love winter, sledding down the hill behind our house, making snow forts, tracking animal prints through fresh powder. Now I stayed inside, watching the woods through frosted windows. I only went outside when Dad made me help with chores, and even then, I never turned my back on the tree line. The snow began melting in late March. As patches of ground poked through the snow, Dad started marking off the yard with wooden stakes and string. On a Saturday morning, he woke me early. "Get dressed," he said. "We're going to town for supplies." We drove to the hardware store where Dad bought lumber, chicken wire, and metal posts. The man behind the counter raised his eyebrows at the amount. "Building a chicken coop, a fence," Dad said, handling over cash. "Pretty extensive fencing. What are you keeping in or out?" Dad didn't answer, just counted his change and headed for the door. Every day after school and all weekend we worked on the fence. Dad dug post holes while the ground was still partially frozen, cursing as he chipped through the hard earth. I helped carry materials and held posts while he cemented them in place. By the end of April, a 6-foot fence encircled our property, the chicken wire reinforced with wooden slats that restricted the view into the surrounding forest. Dad built a gate with a heavy chain and padlock for the driveway. One evening in May, I found Dad on the porch, smoking a cigarette, another new habit since that day in the woods. The air smelled like spring, with buds forming on the trees and the last bits of snow finally melting away. "Dad," I said, leaning against the railing beside him, "can we get another dog?" He took a long drag, the tip of his cigarette flaring orange in the dusk. "No, but I miss having a dog. And you said a dog is good protection." "There's no replacing Bandit," he said, his voice softening for just a moment before hardening again. "And a dog wouldn't have protected you anyway, not from that thing." It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging what we'd seen since that night. "Is it still out there?" I asked, the question I'd been afraid to voice for months. Dad flicked his cigarette into the yard, watching the ember bounce and die against the damp ground. "Yes." "How do you know?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was tight. "I just know, and so do you." He was right. I'd always known deep down that the creature was still out in the woods. The fence, the locks, the Winchester by the door. None of that stuff changed what I knew was true. We were stuck with the memory of what we saw that day. The university campus disappeared in my rearview mirror as I took the highway north toward Marquette County. My colleagues had given me curious looks when I'd announced my sabbatical plans. "You never talk about your father," Dr. Ramirez had said during our department meeting. "And now you're taking a semester to care for him?" I'd shrugged, not knowing how to explain that some bonds weren't about liking each other. Some were about duty, history, and secrets no one else would believe. The drive took 5 hours from Northern Michigan University, though I'd only made it twice in the last 10 years. Once for Mom's funeral 6 years ago, and before that for a Christmas visit that ended with Dad and me barely talking. I passed all the usual spots, the gas station, the old paper mill, and the turn onto County Road 553 that went deeper into the woods. My car bounced over the dirt road leading to the property. My stomach tightened as trees packed in tight on both sides. I'd spent years in therapy trying to make sense of what Dad and I had seen that day in November 1995. My therapist had nodded patiently, telling me how trauma and fear can mess with what you see, especially as a kid. Sometimes I almost believed her. Almost. The cabin came into view looking smaller than I remembered. The wooden fence Dad had built years ago was now falling apart, with whole sections drooping or completely gone. Dead leaves had piled up at the bottom, looking like nobody had raked in months. The for sale sign was gone. Dad never actually sold the place or moved away like Mom wanted. I parked next to Dad's old Ford pickup. The truck's paint had worn away to gray with rust on the wheels. When Uncle Jim called about Dad's stroke, he told me the doctors took away his driving privileges. Not that he goes anywhere, Uncle Jim had said. Barely leaves the house these days. My bags felt really heavy as I took them from the trunk. The afternoon sun was low behind the trees, but the cabin windows were dark. I stopped at the front step, key in hand. After being away so long, it felt weird to just walk in. I knocked and waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder. "Dad, it's Thomas." No response. I got really nervous. Had he suffered another stroke? I twisted the key in the lock and pushed open the door. The cabin smelled musty, like old books and wood smoke. I squinted to see in the darkness. The curtains were pulled shut on every window, letting in only small bits of light. "Dad?" I called again, setting my bags down just inside the door. A figure moved in the living room. I spotted someone sitting in the old armchair that had always been Dad's spot. "You came." His voice sounded rougher than I remembered, like it was worn down by age. As my eyes got used to the darkness, I could see him better. Dad had always been big and solid, but the man in the chair looked smaller somehow, like he'd shrunk. His face had new wrinkles, deep lines around his mouth and between his eyebrows. His hair had turned completely gray. But what caught my attention most was the Winchester rifle across his lap. The same one I dropped in the forest that day. The one he'd used to shoot the creature when it attacked us. "Course I came," I said, stepping farther into the room. "Jim said you needed help after the stroke." Dad's eyes never left mine, checking me out with that uncomfortable staring thing he'd always done. His right hand sat on the Winchester's stock, left hand near the trigger guard, not pointing it at me but not relaxed either. "What's with the gun?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I set down my other bag. Dad's fingers tightened on the rifle. Something flickered in his eyes that took me back 28 years in an instant. That same look I'd seen when we'd burst from the woods running for our lives. "It's back," he whispered. 2 words. That was all it took for ice to fill my veins, for the nightmares to rush forward from wherever I'd locked them away. I stared at him, waiting for him to crack a smile to tell me he was just testing me, but the fear in his eyes was real. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "Started 3 months ago," Dad said, his voice steadier now that he was sharing information. "First, pets disappeared from houses down the road. The Miller's German Shepherd taken right from their yard. Then the Anderson cat, 3 more after that." I stepped closer and turned on a lamp next to the couch. The bright light made Dad blink, but he kept going. Then the Miller boy went missing. Peter, 10 years old, was riding his bike on the county road. Never came home. A sick feeling hit my gut. "Could have been anything," I said, not buying it myself. "Coyotes grab pets all the time and kids run away." Dad's mouth tightened. "That what you tell yourself at night? That what you've been telling yourself for 28 years? I didn't answer. We both knew I still had nightmares about that day, about Bandit lying torn open, about running through the woods with that wet breathing getting closer behind us. "You've seen it?" I finally asked, sinking onto the couch across from him. Dad nodded once, a sharp downward jerk of his chin by the old oak. "Same as before?" "Same. Everything." "Did you tell the police about the boy?" What could I say? Dad's laugh was bitter. That I saw the same monster that killed a dog 28 years ago that no one believed us about then? He was right. We'd never told anyone the full truth of what we saw. When the police had come around asking about the Miller boy back then, the first Peter Miller, we'd said we hadn't seen anything strange in the woods. "Could be coincidence," I said weakly. "You don't believe that?" I didn't. The timing was too perfect. My father's stroke bringing me back just as the thing showed up again, as if it had been waiting all this time. "How's your recovery going?" I asked, changing the subject. Jim said it was a minor stroke. Dad waved a hand dismissively. Left side was weak for a couple weeks. Better now. He tapped the Winchester with one finger. Can still shoot straight. I looked around the cabin. It looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Mail was piled on the kitchen table. Dishes stacked in the sink. A single plate with leftover canned stew sat on the coffee table. "When did Mom's houseplants die?" I asked, noticing the row of brown, withered stems on the windowsill that had once been Mom's pride. "After she did," Dad said flatly. The words hung in the air between us. 6 years, and we'd never really talked about Mom's death. I'd come for the funeral, stayed 3 days, and left. Dad hadn't called once since. "I'm going to unpack," I said, standing up. "Then I'll make us some dinner." Dad nodded, but his eyes looked toward the window, toward the woods past the old fence. His fingers stayed on the Winchester. I picked up my bags and went to my old bedroom. Dad had kept it mostly the same, though the posters I'd had on the walls were gone, leaving behind lighter squares of paint. My bed had fresh sheets. He must have gotten ready for me coming home, even though he wasn't doing well. I sat on the edge of the bed, touching the quilt Mom had made years ago. The walls felt too close. The woods too near. We were back where we started, Dad and I, with the Winchester and the creature, and the fear that lived between the trees. But this time I wasn't a child. This time, whatever was out there wouldn't find us unprepared. I spent my first full day at the cabin cleaning. Dad watched from his armchair, the Winchester never leaving his lap, as I scrubbed counters and swept floors thick with dust. The physical labor helped quiet my mind, pushing away thoughts of what might be in the woods beyond our property. "You don't have to do all that," Dad said as I wiped down the refrigerator shelves. "Place needs it." I dumped another container of expired food into the trash. "When's the last time you went grocery shopping?" He shrugged. "Jim brings things sometimes." By evening, I'd made a list of supplies we needed and drove to the small general store in town. The cashier, an older woman with gray hair and a tight bun, looked me over as she rang up my items. "You're Bob Wilson's boy," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am. Heard he had a stroke. How's he doing?" "Better. I'm staying with him for a while." She nodded, bagging my groceries quickly. "Good. Man shouldn't be alone out there, especially with what's been happening." I paused. "What's been happening? You haven't heard?" She lowered her voice. 5 pets gone missing in the last 3 months. 2 hikers never came back from a day trip up near Hogback Mountain. And now that poor Miller boy. My stomach tightened. "What happened to him?" "Disappeared 3 weeks ago. Was riding his bike on County Road 553. They found the bike, but no boy." She shook her head. "Search parties combed those woods for 2 weeks before they called it off. His poor parents." I paid for the groceries, my mind racing. Back at the cabin, I didn't mention the conversation to Dad. He had enough to worry about. The next morning, I drove into Marquette and found a copy of the local newspaper. Sure enough, there was a small article about the search for Peter Miller, being officially suspended, 10 years old, same age I'd been when we ran into the creature, same name as the boy who disappeared back then. I spent the rest of the week gathering information. The library archives confirmed the pattern, the same as before. Pets disappearing first, then hikers, then a child. I checked online forums where local hunters posted. Several mentioned weird noises in the woods at night and game cameras going missing. At the diner in town, I sat alone with coffee and a sandwich, listening to the conversations around me. 2 men in flannel shirts and worn caps sat at the counter, their voices carrying. "Third camera this month," one was saying. "Just vanishes, no tracks, nothing." "You think it's kids?" his companion asked. "Kids don't go that deep in the woods, and they don't take just the camera and leave them out. What did you catch on the footage before it disappeared?" The first man paused. "Nothing clear." just movement. And the deer all got scared at once, looking at something off camera. I noticed the pattern the same as before. The creature was setting up its territory, getting rid of anything that might take its picture. It was hunting. Dad stayed by the window most days, Winchester ready, eyes checking the tree line. I brought him food, made sure he took his medication, tried to talk to him. Sometimes he'd talk about Mom, about the years after I left for college, but mostly he watched the woods with total focus. "You should go back to the university," he told me on the 5th night, as I set a plate of dinner beside him. "Nothing you can do here. I'm not leaving you alone." He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since I'd arrived. "You still see it, don't you? In your dreams?" I didn't answer, which was answer enough. "It marked us somehow," Dad said quietly. "That day in the woods. It's been waiting." "For what?" "For you to come back." I slept poorly that night, my dreams filled with pale limbs and wet breathing. Around 3 in the morning, a hand shook me awake. Dad stood over my bed, finger to his lips, the Winchester in his other hand. "There," he whispered, pointing toward the window. I got up quietly and went to the window. The moon was bright in the yard. At first, I didn't see anything except the broken fence and the dark trees beyond. Then I noticed something moving. Near the trees, something pale moved between the trunks. I stopped breathing when it came partly into the moonlight. The creature from my nightmares. Skin tight over a long body, it moved in that same weird way I remembered, like a horrible copy of how humans move. Its limbs bent wrong as it crept along the edge of the woods, its head turning like it was checking out the cabin. I just stood there, my adult brain trying to make sense of what I'd seen as a kid all those years ago. It wasn't a bear standing up or a sick, hairless wolf like my therapist had tried to tell me. It wasn't anything normal. The creature stopped, lifting its face with no nose toward the air. Even from far away, I could see the awful holes where eyes should have been. It seemed to be smelling the air, its head turning toward our cabin like it knew exactly where we were. For a moment, I thought it looked right at our window, at me, even though I knew it couldn't see. Then it disappeared back into the darkness between the trees. Dad's hand grabbed my shoulder. "Told you," he whispered. We stayed up the rest of the night watching the woods, but the creature didn't show up again. Morning came with gray light coming through the clouds. Dad had finally fallen asleep in his chair around dawn. I made coffee and went onto the porch looking around the yard in daylight. Nothing looked out of place until I walked to the edge of the property where the fence had completely fallen down. There, carefully arranged at the line between yard and forest, was a dead deer. Not ripped apart by normal animals, but cut open with terrible precision. The organs were gone, leaving the inside empty. The head was completely missing. I looked at the dead deer, feeling sick to my stomach. This wasn't a normal kill. This was a message. Dad came over walking slowly with his cane. He looked down at the deer remains without being surprised. "It knows we're here," he said. I called the police from my cell phone, reporting what we'd found. An officer arrived an hour later and looked skeptical, especially when he saw the deer. "Probably coyotes," he said, not bothering to get close. "They've been bad this year." "Coyotes don't do this," Dad argued. "Look at how clean the cuts are." The officer shrugged. "Could be someone dumped it. Poachers sometimes take just the head for antlers." "It's the same thing that took Peter Miller," I said. The officer's expression hardened. "Sir, we don't joke about that case. I'm not joking. There's something in these woods. It took a boy 28 years ago, too. Another Peter Miller. It's back." "Thomas," Dad warned, but I couldn't stop. "Check your missing persons records from 1995. Same name, same age. It's happening again." The officer took a step back. "I'll file a report about the deer. Please don't move the remains." He headed back to his cruiser without another word. Dad watched him drive away. "They never believe," he said quietly. "We buried the deer remains ourselves, neither of us wanting to look at them anymore." The rest of the day passed in tense silence. I tried calling the police station again, asking to speak with someone about the Miller case, but was politely dismissed. As evening approached, I made a decision. I couldn't sit and wait for the creature to come closer, to take another child, or to finally come for us. The police wouldn't help. No one would believe us without evidence. "I'm going out there," I told Dad as I laced up my hiking boots. He looked up sharply. "No, we need evidence. Pictures, tracks, something the police can't ignore. It'll kill you. It could have killed us both that day in the woods, but it didn't. It's been watching us for 28 years. I need to understand why." Dad stood with effort, grabbing the Winchester from where it leaned against his chair. "Not alone," he said. I wanted to refuse. His stroke had left him weaker than he admitted, and his hands weren't as steady as they once were. But the determination in his eyes stopped me. This was his fight too, had been for longer than mine. We prepared carefully. I found flashlights in the kitchen drawer and checked the batteries. Dad retrieved his old hunting knife from a box in the closet, testing the edge with his thumb before handing it to me. "Remember," he said as I tucked the knife into my belt, "it hunts by sound and smell. It can't see you, but it knows where you are." I nodded, the weight of the knife unfamiliar against my hip. Dad checked the Winchester one last time, loading fresh shells with fingers that trembled slightly. Outside, the sun was starting to go down behind the trees. The yard was getting darker as we got ready to head into the woods together. Dusk settled over the forest as Dad and I crossed the boundary where our yard ended and the wilderness began. The broken fence posts marked a line I hadn't crossed in 28 years, not since that day when Bandit died and something inhuman chased us back to the cabin. Now I was deliberately stepping over that line, my boots crunching on fallen pine needles and twigs. Dad moved more slowly beside me. The Winchester held ready in his hands. His breathing came heavier than it once had, the exertion of walking through uneven terrain, clearly taxing him after his stroke. But his eyes remained sharp, looking over the deepening shadows between the trees with the same vigilance I remembered from childhood. "Stay close," he murmured, voice barely audible above the rustle of leaves overhead. I nodded, one hand resting on the hunting knife at my belt. The metal felt cold against my fingertips. Not much against what we were tracking, but better than nothing. The forest closed around us, looking both like home and somehow strange. These were the same trees I'd played among as a child, the same paths I'd walked with Bandit at my heels. But now everything seemed dangerous, like the woods had soaked up the evil of the creature hunting here. We followed a trail through the bushes where something had passed. Broken branches hanging at weird angles, patches of moss ripped from the ground, strange marks in the soft earth that looked like footprints but were too long, with too many weirdly spaced toes. "It's not hiding its tracks," I said quietly. Dad gave a single nod. Wasn't hiding 28 years ago either. The implication hung between us. The creature wanted to be followed. It was leading us somewhere. As we moved deeper into the forest, it got darker. I clicked on my flashlight, keeping the beam low to avoid broadcasting our position too obviously. Dad did the same, moving his light back and forth across the ground ahead. The forest smelled exactly as I remembered: pine sap, decaying leaves, and the fresh scent of the nearby creek. Running these trails with Bandit, learning to track deer with Dad. That final hunt when everything changed. The years I'd spent in therapy trying to convince myself it had all been a childhood trauma response. A bear or wolf that fear turned into something monstrous felt hollow now. "There," Dad whispered, pointing ahead with the barrel of the Winchester. About 50 yards ahead stood the huge oak tree where he'd spotted the creature 3 nights ago. Even from here I could see it was really old, with a trunk wider than Dad and me standing side by side, its branches stretching out against the darkening sky. We moved carefully, going from tree to tree for cover. The oak tree looked even bigger up close, its bark deeply cracked with age. Dad told me to go left while he went right, both of us moving toward the tree from different sides. As I came around the huge trunk, my flashlight beam showed something that made me freeze. Fresh cuts marked the bark deep enough to show the pale wood underneath. They were in sets of 4, each mark about 2 inches wide, curving down like something had dug its claws in and pulled them down the trunk. Dad showed up on the other side, his flashlight showing similar marks on his side of the tree. Our eyes met, and I could tell he was thinking exactly what I was. "It wants us here," I said, the words barely audible. Dad nodded, raising the Winchester to his shoulder, looking at the branches overhead and the surrounding darkness. "Stay alert." I turned slowly, knife now drawn, and held ready. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. Just our breathing. The attack came without warning, a rush of movement from above. A pale creature dropping from the branches super fast. Dad cried out as the creature landed on his back, knocking him to his knees. The Winchester hit the tree trunk but didn't fire. I didn't think. I reacted. 3 strides brought me to them. The creature was on top of Dad. I plunged the hunting knife into its side with all my strength. The blade sank in with surprising ease, not as tough as I expected. The creature let go of Dad right away, making a high-pitched screeching noise as it turned toward me. Black fluid oozed from the wound. It stood up straight, taller than me by at least a foot. Its face turned toward mine. Its mouth opened, showing rows of jagged teeth. Dad scrambled for the Winchester, moving slower because he was hurt. The creature took a step toward me. I backed away, knife held in front of me. The Winchester fired with a loud bang. The creature jerked backward as the shot hit its chest. It staggered but didn't fall, and made an even louder screech. Dad loaded another round, but before he could fire again, the creature dropped to all 4s and ran away really fast, disappearing into the bushes. Black droplets marked its path. "You okay?" I gasped, helping Dad to his feet. He nodded, face pale but determined. "We hit it. Both of us." "It's bleeding," I said, pointing to the trail of black fluid. "We can track it." Dad checked the Winchester, making sure it was still functional after being dropped. "It's wounded. That makes it more dangerous. We can't let it get away. Not again." He met my eyes, and I could see a hint of pride on his face. Then he nodded once. "Stay behind me." We followed the trail of black fluid, walking carefully through the forest as it got darker. The droplets were easy to spot, shining wet in our flashlight beams. They took us deeper into the woods, away from any trails, through clusters of young pines and around massive boulders. About 20 minutes later, the trail led to a rocky ledge partly covered by thick brush. Black fluid marked a narrow opening between 2 big rocks. Looked like the entrance to a cave. "It went in there," I whispered. Dad raised the Winchester, aiming at the dark opening. Could be its den. The thought of entering that darkness, of cornering the wounded creature in its own territory, made my mouth go dry. But we'd come too far to turn back now. "I'll go first," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Dad shook his head. Together. We pushed aside the brush and got closer to the cave entrance. The smell hit us first, a sickly, sweet smell of rot that got stronger as we got near the opening. I pulled my shirt collar over my nose, but it didn't help much with the stink. Our flashlights only lit up a few feet ahead in the dark. The cave got wider past the entrance, with the ceiling about 7 feet high. Black fluid marked the stone floor, leading deeper inside. Dad and I looked at each other. We didn't need to say anything. We came to find evidence, and it was in there. We went in slowly, moving our flashlights across the rough stone walls. The cave went back about 30 feet before ending in a round chamber. When our lights showed the space, I stopped in my tracks, feeling sick. Bones, hundreds of them. Animal and human spread across the cave floor or stacked in corners. Some were clearly fresh, bits of flesh still stuck to them. Others were older, turned yellow with age. Skulls of deer and smaller animals mixed with what were definitely human remains. Leg bones, ribs, pieces of skulls. My God, Dad breathed beside me. In the center of the cave was what looked like a nest. A dip in the floor lined with fabric that I realized with disgust were pieces of clothing, torn shirts, pants, a child's jacket. And there, half buried among the bones and fabric, was a small sneaker, white with blue stripes, covered with dried mud. I knelt beside it, my flashlight showing writing on the rubber sole and black marker. Peter Miller. Call the police, Dad said, his voice tight. Now. I pulled out my cell phone, surprised to find I had signal this deep in the woods. As I dialed 911, Dad kept the Winchester trained on the cave entrance, his body tense. 911, what's your emergency? My name is Thomas Wilson, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm with my father, Robert Wilson. We're in the woods off County Road 553, about 2 miles east of our property. We found evidence related to the Peter Miller disappearance. The dispatcher's voice sharpened. What kind of evidence, sir? His shoe and human remains. We're in a cave. I can share my phone's location. Please do that, sir. Are you in any immediate danger? I looked at the black fluid trail leading deeper into the cave, disappearing into a crevice too small for us to follow. I don't think so. Not right now. Officers are being dispatched to your location. Please stay on the line. Dad and I waited in that charnel house for 45 minutes, neither of us speaking much, both watching the cave entrance and the small crevice where the creature had disappeared. I wondered how far that passage went, whether it connected to other caves, other hunting grounds. When we finally heard voices calling from outside, Dad lowered the Winchester. 3 officers entered the cave cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Their professional demeanor cracked as they took in the scene, the bones, the clothing, the small sneaker with Peter Miller's name. One officer, older than the others, looked at Dad with new respect. You were right, he said simply. Dad just nodded, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. The cave became a crime scene. More officers arrived than forensic technicians. Dad and I were separated, questioned thoroughly about how we'd found the cave, what we'd seen. I told them everything except the nature of the creature, saying only that we'd tracked an animal we believed responsible for killing deer on our property. As dawn broke, we stood outside the cave watching the activity. Evidence bags were carried out one after another. A forensic technician confirmed what we already knew. The remains included those of a child matching Peter Miller's age and build. What do you think happened to it? I asked Dad quietly, as we were finally allowed to leave. He looked toward the deeper woods, his face grim. It's still out there, wounded, but alive. Will it come back? Dad's hand tightened on the Winchester. Maybe, but not soon. We walked home in silence as morning light came through the trees. The forest seemed different now, still dangerous, but no longer holding the same power over us. We had faced our terror together and survived again. At the edge of our property, Dad paused, looking back at the woods. You were right to come back, he said. I nodded, understanding what he meant. Some things couldn't be outrun or forgotten. Some things had to be faced. We crossed the broken fence line together, returning to the cabin as the sun rose fully above the trees.